Did the Pope cite established Catholic dogma on the just war theory by a prominent state?
You're questioning the Pope citing?
Yes. Yeah, I am actually.
Catholic
You're allowed
dogma?
to. You're allowed to do that.
Well, look, and then so did J.D. Vance.
We had another far-right MAGA meltdown this time on Abby Phillips' show with Sarah Seidner filling in, and Joe Belli ended up twisting his own logic into knots while trying to defend Donald Trump and putting himself in a corner with his arguments. And in this segment, we're going to look at clips from a heated and at times very chaotic panel discussion featuring Joe Belli, S.E. Cupp, and others, and I also have some thoughts I want to share about what was said and how the conversation unfolded. So, let's get into it together.
Hey there, I'm Sarah Seidner in New York. America has a come-to-Jesus moment of sorts, but in politics, after a week of surreal events involving the Trump administration using religion to hit back at scrutiny of its war with Iran. The president deleted a picture depicting himself as Jesus after a bipartisan backlash.
I thought it was me as a doctor and had to do with Red Cross as a Red Cross. It's supposed to be me as a doctor, making people better.
He posted another picture, this time of the two hugging. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth likened Trump to Jesus, calling reporters the enemies of Christ.
As the passage ends, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel against him, how to destroy him. I sat there in church and I thought, our press are just like these Pharisees.
Hegseth wasn't the only one who compared Trump to Christ.
I believe that Donald Trump is better than sliced bread. I think he's almost the second coming, in my humble opinion.
And in a twist, a Hollywood script entered the chat when Hegseth used a classic Tarantino movie quote during a prayer.
We often look somewhere else and look at trials through the wrong lens, and Jesus understands what kind of recipe we need for his purpose. Which leads me finally to a prayer that I'll read, which was also handed to me a couple.
And here Pete Hegseth goes on to recite the prayer quote from Pulp Fiction that Quentin Tarantino wrote, and I had to remove this from my video because it is copyrighted, and I do not think it is actually Quentin Tarantino.
Used a quote given to him by pilots involved in the rescue of the airmen in Iran. This was just the backdrop to a holy war of words between the Vatican and the United States. The president picked fights with the Pope after Leo called for peace and an end to the violence and warned about tyrants using religion for military gain. Trump's allies then began to lecture the Vatican.
I think it's very, very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology. You've got to make sure it's anchored in the truth.
The Pope needs to keep his business into leading his flock, so to speak, leading the church, and probably stay out of the political arena.
A pontiff or any religious leader can say anything they want, but obviously if you wade into political waters, I think you should expect some political response, and I think the Pope's received some of that.
So at this point, suddenly Republicans don't want religion in politics. Now to our table, what's with the holy war? I guess first to you, Joe.
Well, look, going to the Pope, I think Speaker Johnson's comments were probably the best. If the Pope is going to use his office and his place as not just a religious head, but as a head of state to engage in politics, you should expect some incoming back. And I'm actually, I think back to Pope Pius VII in World War II, who gets criticized for not speaking up against Nazi atrocities, the genocide against Jews. And I am wondering why the Pope doesn't make more stronger statements against what's happening within Iran, within the regime, the behavior that they've exemplified over the last 40 years. Look, I'm not saying, the situations are the same, but it is weird to have a Pope only taking the side of Iran and not criticizing them for their atrocities.
It probably is not fair to say he's taking the side of Iran. He is quoting
takes the side of peace.
If you're taking one side,
quoting scripture, and he's talking about peace.
Trump's mic drop moment was when he was asked about 4 protesters Iran is going to plan to kill over the next day or two, and he said, ask the Pope. And he's right, the Pope has not weighed in on that. So to have the Pope weigh in, look, there is a long Catholic tradition of popes weighing in on politics. We expect the Pope to weigh in on peace, to support peace. I expect the Pope even to weigh in on the migrant crisis and things like that. But you have a war that's prosecuted against the number one state sponsor of terrorism, a state that uses its proxies to murder innocent civilians everywhere, a state that has murdered, by conservative estimates, 30,000 people within the last year. Maybe save the outrage for them, Your Eminence.
So Joe Belli and others bring up World War II and try to compare it to modern conflicts, but these are not really comparable situations, because in World War II, the United States was directly attacked by Japan, which led to America entering the war, while in other modern conflicts like the situation with Iran, the argument is that the United States was not directly attacked in the same way, and this is why many people see those comparisons as misleading and not accurate, and the point being made here is that you cannot treat every war or military action as the same because the causes and circumstances are very different, and in this discussion it is also argued that some describe recent military actions as offensive or wars of choice rather than direct self-defense, and that is where the disagreement comes from, especially in political debates on shows like Abby Phillips' program, where different guests strongly challenge each other's interpretations, and beyond the policy debate there is also criticism aimed at public figures like Pete Hegseth and others, with some questioning their qualifications and decision-making in leadership roles, while also reacting to moments in public speeches or events where comments about prayer or references to pop culture like Pulp Fiction are brought up in a serious setting, which creates mixed reactions among audiences, including some who find it inappropriate or even ironic, depending on the context.
Right? I mean, this is the ultimate underlying point. All of a sudden, we see the Trump administration trying to misuse faith for political purposes almost every day, including the posts of the president comparing himself to Jesus. And yet when the Pope actually talks about New Testament values of promoting peace against a preemptive war, which is not a condoning what executions in Iran at all, then all of a sudden he's on the wrong side of the politics. And so he gets demonized, and they basically say, shut up and dribble.
Do you think Iran's not responsible for proxy wars that have been existing for 40 years?
Of course they do, but that's like literally nothing to do with the larger
nothing
point.
To do. Come on.
Literally nothing.
Nothing?
Literally
That's
nothing
a stretch,
to do with
John,
it. No, Joe, no,
nothing?
no.
Come on.
Look, here's why. When you get Pete Hegseth, who misquotes the Bible by quoting from a fake verse, pious and bringing religion into the Pentagon every day, quoting something from Pulp Fiction, it's a perfect encapsulation of the problem. They're trying to weaponize faith. They're trying to weaponize faith and fundamentally misunderstand it. And that's the endemic problem.
Trump doesn't understand religion or Christianity. He has no fluency with it. It's not a second, third, fourth language. He doesn't know it at all. And what he didn't get was that Catholics are very different from evangelicals. And Catholics only voted for Trump by 50% in 2016, 55% in 2024. And Catholics read on the Bible is very different from an evangelical worldview. In evangelicalism, you've got prosperity theology, you've got preachers who say, give me millions of your dollars so that I can live in a big mansion. Catholics eschew that. And so to see Trump and Hegseth's and J.D. Vance's interpretation of the Bible and Jesus and Scripture being so sacrilegious turns off Catholics in a way it does not necessarily turn off evangelicals. And to lose a Catholic base when he's already losing among independents, among young people, among men, among Hispanics, he just can't afford it.
Go ahead.
Call me old-fashioned. I harken back to a time where we talked about the separation of church and state. I don't want it's in the Constitution, by the way. I don't want our leaders promoting any religion. I'm not a Christian, but I don't think my religion's better than any other religion. I don't think Christianity's better than any other religion. The military, by the way, has people of all religions. Muslims, by the way, which the president insulted horrendously just a week ago. And just think about our opponents, the Iranians. That's a theocracy. That's what we're against.
That's what we don't.
And Josh Rogan here points out that the United States is supposed to be a secular country and that there is meant to be a separation between church and state, and he directs this point toward Joe Belli and others in the discussion, arguing that political decision-making and government authority should not be directly tied to religious influence or religious framing, and the broader point being made is about maintaining that constitutional principle in public institutions, especially when discussing political arguments on televised panels where religion sometimes gets brought into policy debates.
We're for pluralism,
last week,
we're for democracy,
last
we're for
week,
people having whatever religion they want, but not making it part of our military or our government, because that's not what America is.
Because we were talking about support and what's going on, I want you to listen to what we're hearing from some folks who were big Trump supporters. Take a listen, and you mentioned Benny Johnson. He happens to be in this as well.
It's completely inappropriate, and he knows it. I don't know why the president's getting so desperate for attention that he feels the need to mock 1.4 billion Catholics. It's enough, okay? It's enough with this nonsense.
I'm also offended when anyone projects themselves as Christ.
We should not have a president who gleefully blasphemes the faith of, by far, the vast majority of his supporters.
Joe, do you think this was a mistake? Just a big, ugly mistake?
I think the president thought it was a mistake, and certainly I do. He took it down. That was the right thing to do.
But then he lied about it.
Look. Last week the gospel was about doubting Thomas, and doubting Thomas is the guy who had to, see it to believe it. You said that Catholics were abandoning Donald Trump. I was at a Catholic gala. Yeah, you literally said Catholics were abandoning.
No, I didn't.
We could run the tape. You said Catholics are abandoning Donald Trump, not in the same way evangelicals are. So
no, I said Catholics are more offended than evangelicals are.
I was at a Catholic gala last night. I go to church. My kids play in Catholic leagues. I don't know one Catholic who was a Trump supporter. I'm not saying there aren't, but who was a Trump supporter who was that offended about the picture, or
you just saw a bunch of them on screen.
Or that offended. I'm saying Catholics. Or that offended by what Trump has done vis-a-vis Iran with respect to what the Pope's criticism was, and is now not supporting the president. I don't know one. Honestly, I do not know one.
But yeah,
we just played some.
You're taking they would rather take Donald Trump, the president, over the Pope, the leader
The
of the
Pope
church.
polls way better than Donald Trump.
The Pope, I think the Pope is wrong for criticizing America without criticizing the Iranian regime. I think
Isn't
that's
that just about?
I think that's
but
you know,
do you
we think that
he's
the Pope speaks
excusing
ex
the Iranian
cathedra and
regime?
is infallible on very certain matters. The Pope can be wrong about a lot of things. This happens to be one of them.
But he is talking about peace, and that could be to everyone, right? I mean, when you say peace could be...
He criticized people for tyrants dropping bombs. I mean, that was a direct
He said
attack.
God doesn't bless conflict.
Why did you feel
Period. He didn't say God doesn't bless U.S. conflict or God doesn't bless Iran. He said God doesn't bless conflict.
Correct.
There is nothing more anodyne than what the Pope said about war and peace.
St. Augustine has a just war theory, which war is just. This is Catholic tradition.
The Iran war doesn't apply to
Did the Pope cite established Catholic dogma on the just war theory by a
You're
prominent state?
questioning the
He
Pope
did.
citing?
Yes. Yeah, I am actually.
Catholic
You're allowed to.
dogma?
You're allowed to do that.
Well, look, and then so did J.D. Vance.
Yes, he did.
And look, I'm all about just war theory, but somehow I think the objection isn't about misapplication of just war theory and more about criticizing a preemptive war.
By the way, this was the conversation at St. Agnes's Church after Mass this week in Naples, Florida. Just for the record, we were talking about this.
Well, God,
We were talking about this.
With other people, yes.
well, God, if she does exist, I don't think supports war in any form.
I love the parable when the Secretary of War goes out, cheats on his wives, gets wasted, and then quotes Pulp Fiction. That's my favorite parable from the New Testament.
And we will end this part of the show there. Next, more and more MAGA.
So here the speaker is expressing strong frustration with the panel discussion and specifically reacting to how SE Cup responds by laughing at what they see as inconsistent or weak arguments from figures like Joe Belly and others aligned with Donald Trump's political circle, and they also bring up comments from the Pope about God not blessing conflict, using that as part of a broader critique of whataboutism in political debates where one issue is deflected by pointing to another situation. Instead of directly addressing the original point, and the argument being made here is that this kind of back and forth often leads to more confusion than clarity, especially when serious topics like war and civilian harm are being discussed, and the speaker also criticizes political surrogates who defend Trump by constantly reinterpreting or reframing statements instead of letting them stand on their own, suggesting that this kind of messaging creates unnecessary complexity and weakens the overall argument rather than strengthening it. Just shut up about it and maybe some of this stuff would blow over more quickly. But they can't help themselves. They have to constantly suck up to the so-called leader at all times, and everyone else is exhausted by it. At least I know I am exhausted with this administration, and we still have years left of this. And then the discussion turns back to the panel, asking what people think about the exchange involving SE Cup, Josh Rogan, and John Avlon, and whether viewers agree with the panel's criticism of Joe Borelli or disagree and side with him instead, framing it as a broader debate about media narratives and political priorities. Then it shifts into a commentary about religious hypocrisy, suggesting that some political figures who identify as Christian or Catholic and support MAGA politics are inconsistent in their beliefs, arguing that they elevate political leaders above their religious teachings, and the segment ends by asking viewers to share their opinion, like and subscribe, and tune in for the next video from the channel.